and come across and grab all this oil. Well, it's us that have grabbed the oil. So it's not the Soviets that they're afraid of. The Soviets have a defense capability, and they're chary of it, but they're doing whatever they can to outstrip it and get to the point where they can overcome it in their terms, even if that means limited nuclear war in their scenario. But the people that they're afraid of, finally, is just us, because if we get the point, if we unravel the lie, and we take it apart, and we claim democracy and liberation, and we claim our own destiny, then that's it. That's the end of the game. And that's what the whole national security and secrecy concept is about. They're not lying to them. I mean, they come on the Contragate testimony and they say the Soviets knew, the Cubans knew, the Nicaraguans knew. It was only the Americans that aren't allowed to know. You see? I mean, the Americans aren't supposed to get the information. And so attempts to bring that information in are blocked, the press is controlled, and the lies go on day in and day out. And they plan well ahead. My mother was 5 levels above top security in the Pentagon, had access to the war room. She was the highest paid woman employee of the DOD for 30 years, civilian employee, under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, a manpower analyst. Her job was to take a current force level of the whole military. Then the Joint Chiefs would give her a projected force level down the pike, and she would project how many would die, how many would retire, how many would re-up, how many would discharge under each category, and how many then had to be drafted. And she would give them an overall annual draft call figure. Those figures that they used all through the Vietnam War, and that translated later into what lottery number they got to in the draft. Those were projected by my mother in the Defense Department. All right? And she had to give them that annual national draft call figure right within 100 people either way for the year. Now, you're talking about years when they drafted up to 500,000 people.
Okay, here's where I have to fast forward and then turn over the tape. This is KPFK Los Angeles. We're listening to John Judge speaking in July 1987 on Contragate. Tapes are available. It's on a C90 and a C60. We've played side 1, tape 1 so far. Tapes are available from Paul Bernardino. Bernardino, Paul Bernardino, Info Network, 747 Ellis Street, ELLIS, 747 Ellis Street, number 4, San Francisco 94102. This is John Judge, July 1987 on Contragate. And we continue. He's just getting warmed up.
Thanks. 5 years ahead. And I asked her after she retired in the 70s, when did they tell you they would escalate the war in Vietnam? Because she had to be among the first to know. She said late November 1963. The 22nd that Kennedy gets it in Dallas. She said the Monday following the assassination. I said, was this a minor escalation, a few more troops? She said, I couldn't believe the figures. I took them back to the Joint Chiefs and I said, these can't be right. And they said, those are the figures and you'll use them. This is November 25, 1963. They told her the war would last 10 years in Vietnam and 57,000 Americans would die. Exactly on target. They plan ahead, they plan generations ahead. Not everything works. They had a wider war planned into Cambodia, into Laos, into Thailand, the whole Southeast Asian sector that they had to abandon because of the GI movement, because of the struggle of the Vietnamese, because of the anti-war movement back home. They had to abandon an even wider war. So not every plan goes through. But don't think that they sit and wait or respond the next day to something in the news. They create the scandal. They create the crisis. They create the phony terrorism so that they can go and bomb Libya. They bomb the only disco in Beirut that allows black service members to be in a bar with white women in Germany. And a black NCO is murdered in the bombing. And they send a form letter from the White House, a telegram without a signature from Reagan, to the family. And you know how Reagan likes to mug and cry. He loves to go to funerals. It's a favorite thing with him. And Nancy, hug everybody. It's the only physical contact they get, probably, you know. And he doesn't go near. I mean, they just send this form letter. Sorry about that, but it's enough for national policy to go and bomb Libya, you know. And then, well, a few weeks later, we found out it wasn't Libya after all. It was some section of the PLO that happened to be connected to the CIA, but it's all right. We almost got him anyway. But, you know, it wasn't any different in 1939 at the Polish border when the Nazi troops went up and shot the Polish border guards dead and then took their uniforms off and dressed them in the German uniforms and dragged the bodies back across into Germany. And then said that the Polish guards had killed the German guards and then went to war with Poland. That's Operation Canned Meat, 1939. The first casualty of war is the truth. That's Aeschylus, the Greek, 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's not that hard to figure out. You can't start a war any other way except with a lie. And so they're going to give you one. And the second outline of this has to do with U.S. overthrow and U.S. intervention in many, many countries. The lies that allow us, to the population, that allow us to go in and mess with the politics in Chile or the Honduras or Nicaragua or El Salvador or South Africa, Rhodesia or Zimbabwe or Zaire, or wherever it is that we're sticking the CIA and these interventions and backgrounders are using surrogate troops. That's the second level. Because Ollie North is not in the NSC anymore, but it was in the society page what his job is now. He's in the Marine Corps Plans and Mobilization Division at the Pentagon. He's in charge of mobilizing Marines everywhere in the world. He's going to make the decision if there's a Marine intervention. And part of building a war at this point with the history of Vietnam that they haven't, as long as they've waited, been able to erase, even for the current generation. They failed in Grenada. That's why they wouldn't let the press in. They didn't know if U.S. troops, primarily black troops in the 82nd 101st Airborne crack units, would be able to be sent successfully against English-speaking blacks in Grenada. And a 6-hour invasion took 3 days because they refused on the field as they had in Vietnam. And they were not given court-martials because they didn't want it in the press. They were given bad discharges. We talked to the AWOLs coming back from Grenada. We know of instances all across the island. And so after that, the Rapid Deployment Force plans were dropped for the 82nd 101st. They tried to switch over to primarily white units in Texas. That plane that went down in Greenland, Aero Air, the defective plane that tailed out twice at the 2 airports and then went down in Greenland and killed about 180 black U.S. troops. Those were the troops from Fort Campbell from the 101st Airborne that had refused in Grenada. It was those troops. And they replaced the troops in the unit after that. But they weren't able to carry it out successfully because they had opposition within the ranks. And so they're afraid, and they're afraid of what's going to happen here. And what you see in the newspapers, if you did see it on the 5th, in the Mercury or the Miami Herald about Oliver North's martial law plans and Federal Emergency Management Agency and the DOD coming in order to set up martial law, the trigger was either nuclear war, or it could be nuclear terrorism, or it was military mobilization in the United States, or an insurrection here at home. And so the first plan is to round up the Central American refugees, 400,000 of them. The second level is to round up the civilian dissidents, because they have to increase the domestic repression in order to be able to start into a full-scale war in the Third World. And then the third level, the ongoing secret government, the continuation of the financing with guns and drugs, which are the only two commodities worth anything now, much more than gold or silver or the printed money. Guns and drugs are the means of exchange on the international level, and they finance all of this, the ongoing assassinations and murders, and the level of the orchestrated scandal. And that's what I'll try to finish with and it's sort of the core of what I tried to talk about the other day on Barry's show, and then we can have some questions. But how this scandal, which feeds into all of those overall plans and backs them up, is really orchestrated, I believe, as a surgical incision to remove Reagan and the forces loyal to Reagan, as would have been done in March 31, 1981, had the flechette not struck the 7th rib and ended up a quarter of an inch from the aorta. Reagan would have been on the ground. Instead, the Secret Service involved were screaming into the microphones, "Rawhide is okay," and pushed him into the car because he wasn't dead already, and tried to take him to Bethesda. Maybe do the same autopsy they did on him as they did on John F. Kennedy. And they would have done it that day with Bush out in Dallas on Air Force One. But they missed by an inch, and Hinckley took the rap. And Hinckley's family lived in Dallas on the same street and made all their social arrangements with another Dallas oil magnate named George Bush. And it's this same George Bush who's moving Oliver North and Poindexter and the secret team brought in by William Clark into the National Security Council from the Pentagon for the military coup d'etat that they have achieved. And they're moving in this testimony to take Reagan out and set Bush up as the incumbent, and to move Bush from that position probably into a position where he'll take on someone like Haig, who he's very close to, as a vice presidential candidate, or one of the other fascists, Kemp, who relates to the Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations and the World Anti-Communist League openly, or the other ones that are running, you know, on those tickets out there, and continue to eliminate the Democratic opposition if it gets in the way, so that they can put Bush into office at this point. And that's in the same way that Nixon was moved out by Watergate. That the purpose of Watergate was not to expose, I mean, so what? They broke into a room. I mean, that's a national scandal. They broke into a room, they tried to steal some secrets from Larry O'Brien, you know. What are the Democrats doing for the election? I mean, they stole the debate books from Carter. That didn't take Reagan out of office. We weren't all scandalized and called off the election by that, so why is it a scandal the first time? It's because Nixon had to be moved out so that we got the appointed, you know, Ford and Rockefeller is who comes in, you know, in the interim. And then Haig, well, Haig really comes in. It's ex-President Haig, I always say. He ran the White House. I mean, he surrounded Nixon. He threw out everybody that was loyal to him. They all had to go stay over at the Watergate. They couldn't even come. He brought in the Fort Devens 8, a PSYWAR team, psychological warfare team from the military, to surround Nixon day in and day out. Kissinger's in there in case he starts crying, to feed him a little bourbon. And then who comes out? And Kissinger's the pal of these people too, you know, and who comes out on the steps to say, we found the smoking gun? Haig and Jaworski. We found this tape, and we told the president, if you don't reveal it, we have to reveal it. And it's by Ronnie, too, because these are the forces that are moving. Now, he's fighting back. That's what happened to Bill Casey. You know, what happened to Bill Casey? I don't remember. I'm in the cab, and it says Bill Casey decided to resign today. White House spokesman said it was his decision. I said to Cabby, I didn't think he was having ideas anymore. You know, I mean, they mistook his frontal lobe for a tumor somewhere in there. And he's complete. And who's in the room with him to help him write the 2-sentence resignation? Anyone remember? Meese. Ed Meese is sitting in the room, you know. So what we have in the... I brought these sections, and I'll just try to go through them real quick. This is from the most important parts of my Contragate file. I'm not going to go into these articles. This is the overview, and as I say, these other committees are going to be very important because it is possible with public pressure to try to get the history of the drugs and the narcotics that's involved with this, and that could actually catch Bush by the tail because that's who he's most intimately linked with. But the oil scandals laid out, Oliver North, you know, was the one that edited and with Poindexter the Kirkpatrick document. Do you remember the Kirkpatrick document from Gene Kirkpatrick? And it says the essence of the rapid deployment force is to take immediate action in the event of an oil embargo, rebellion or revolution, or an outbreak of local conflicts between them. And they want to establish what they call political dominance over key strategic zones. That's what they talk about. So that's the oil. And they have an article for the decoders and what country it is. Country 1 is Israel. I guess U.S. isn't one anymore. Country 2, Saudi Arabia. You know, and you have the little codes and who's there, but the level of it all is just all this Saudi money comes in. It starts to roll with the policy. And people say, well, what is Contragate? What's going on? And Bud McFarlane comes up and he says, I was afraid Gene Kirkpatrick would call me a commie. And so, you know, I mean, it's like if you tried to listen to it and figure out what on earth they were talking about, you couldn't possibly get to it, you know. They go back and forth, and the main issue is, did Reagan know or didn't Reagan know? And when did he know? They had this great cartoon, Baker's in the White House, and he's asking Reagan, what did you know, and did you ever know that you knew it? It's all in the cartoons. You don't have to read the whole paper, because it really is. Every section I had a cartoon. This is Oliver North. I didn't engage in the fantasy that I was the president or the vice president or a cabinet member or even director of the National Security Council. I've already got Mr. Reagan, Mr. Bush, and others engaged in that fantasy. So he was doing it for the president, but the president didn't know, and they thought it was better not to tell him, you know. And Ollie North comes out. I mean, they had one good picture. I guess everybody in here can't see it. It's North in the Chronicle standing next to all these documents. But you know, he's got his jacket off, and he doesn't have the Boy Scout grin, and he's got maybe I'll pass it. It's got a 5 o'clock shadow, and he really looks like North, the slimy little assassin from Vietnam and Operation Phoenix, the dirty killer and drug runner and covert operator, the racist dog. I can't say enough that he is. This is a real picture. I mean, this is Ollie North, you know. Not that little Catholic grin, hi, sister, you know, that he learned when he was in grade school, but the real fellow here at the office, you know, every secretary's dream. Fawn Hall, 10 years with classified documents. Now, she's only 27. She said, I've been handling documents for 10 years. Not one of them says, geez, how'd you get in that position when you were 17? Came to the Pentagon at 15. I could have gone in at 15. Pentagon Library. My parents would have got me a job. I didn't want to work for them. I got in trouble at 10 because I wouldn't hide under the desk for the atom bomb. I got kicked out of the room, sent to the principal. But I asked him what the bomb did, and I knew the desk wouldn't protect me. So I'm going to sit under there like a dolt. Then I wanted to know why they used things like that, you know, and had something to do. So I didn't want it, but she got it. And her mother is who got her the job with all the documents, and her mother was the personal secretary to who? Henry Kissinger. For years and years in the National Security Council. In the NSC, she's Kissinger's secretary, so they're not separate. She knew Donna Rice. They had the same modeling agent. All right? I mean, the connections... Well, don't get me going. Everyone's connected to everyone, probably someone in this room. This says, bad news, Mr. President. Poindexter's been granted immunity. He says, oh, that's okay. I've been granted amnesia. But see, my answer is it doesn't matter. I think Reagan's not lying. I know it's a terrible thing to say because we all like to think the president's lying. I think he's lying. I don't think he knew. And the reason I don't think he knew was when the Tower Commission report came out and Webster made the statements, they named a day. And they said on this day, Reagan approved the finding for the arms to go. And I have a chrono file on Reagan, so I went back through my clippings to that day. Because I had a suspicion. It was a day I slightly remembered wondering about George Bush that day. That was the day in the Tower Commission report that Reagan was in prostate surgery. And there was even an article the next day saying, well, maybe he was sedated. And they had him sign it sedated. You know, and he doesn't remember because he was kind of groggy from the surgery. But that day, there was an article in the Washington Post, maybe it didn't get out here to the West Coast, that said that they didn't want a crisis to develop, you know, and they'd have a crisis management problem because Reagan, what if Reagan died And so they made George Bush acting president for 8 hours that day. So Bush was president the day that everybody says it was approved. So I think he's right. Bush approved it, and Reagan's like, did I approve that? Okay, I'll just do a few more minutes. So they've got us going back and forth on whether he knew. Let it go. Bush knew. That's enough. That's what you need to know. And then the next thing they want us to believe is that it was all Casey, because Casey's dead and he can't say anything, and it was all Moreau, and he's dead and he can't say anything. You know, the dead are the best ones to blame it on. You know, so Casey's out of the way. So Casey did it all, and he had all this money, and he was going to set up this secret CIA, but nobody is asking yet, where is that money? And Reagan's the only one I saw say it. They had a quote. He said, I still want to know where all our money went. You know? I mean, do you really believe that they, like, if you put $1,000 in the bank and the wrong account, and, you know, would you leave it go 7 months, and you said, well, I was going to put it in there and somebody was going to transfer it over here, and you ask everybody but the bank where the money went? Did you get it yet? No. You know? Jeez. But it's $10 million, for Christ's sake. $10 million. They had this one cartoon, these two old people, and the guy opens it up, and he says, oh, that dumb Ollie North. He says, my bank statement, another $10 million deposited by mistake. You know, it's like, how dumb can they be? I mean, it's like McCord and the second piece of tape in Watergate. When you put a piece of tape to keep the door open for the operation, and you come back down, and Frank Wills, the guard, has taken it off, and the door's locked, and you open the door back up, what do? You run upstairs and you say, it's cut. I mean, the operation's known. There's danger. We have to get out. What does McCord do? What's the name of his book? A Second Piece of Tape. He puts the tape back on. So then when Frank Wills comes around again, he finds it again, then he has to call the cops. It's not like tape left over from last night's burglary. You know, it's like today's. So he has to call the police. And then across the street is McCord's guy, Baldwin. You see, and North's in the same position to set this thing up, you know, in charge of national crisis. That's what McCord did. 16-man committee in the White House, Office of Emergency Preparedness. He had control of all mail-in media in the United States in time of national emergency. That's who McCord was. That's how high up. All right, all mail and all media he would have controlled militarily when they took over. He's not some bumbling guy doesn't know, you know, how to put a piece of tape on. He's a 20-year mechanic. I mean, he knows what he's doing. And so you don't, you know, they compromise, and he's got Baldwin over there with a walkie-talkie, and he's watching. And the lights go on the first floor and the second floor and the third floor, and they're up on 7. And they're searching. He can see them come in and out of each room, and then they turn off the lights as they go. Does he pick up the walkie-talkie and say, you know, cheese it, it's the cops? No. He lets them get right to the 7th floor and arrest them, you see? And then you start the scandal, all right, in the same way that you can orchestrate this one. But the other fascinating thing to me, well, they don't know where the money went, and they're going to blame it all on Casey, because Casey's not talking. But the other thing that just I found very interesting was that they all are up there and they say, like, well, the Boland Amendment didn't apply to us, you know? And it's like, oh, you'd start thinking the Boland Amendment was only passed to apply to Boland, all right? But the real point is that it didn't, you see, because you don't understand what the NSC is. It was put in there in 1947. It was Herbert Hoover's idea. He's the one that raised all the money internationally to finance the rearmament of Germany from 1918 to 1936. Herbert Hoover, and he was with the industrialists and the monarchists, and they wanted to get the Bolshevik Revolution out, and he raised money, and they pumped it in, and they rearmed Germany, and they set up Hitler to go back and take the mother country and get Russia and get the resources. And he's the one that thought up the NSC. And it's in there to not be the Congress, not be the legislature, not even be the intelligence agencies. It's extra legal, extra governmental, and so it doesn't apply. And that's what nobody's getting. That's why they all come up there and say, well, yeah, if it had been the CIA, it would have applied. You see, and it really was pieces. Sure, Dewey Claridge is CIA. He was intimately involved, so you can link it that way. That's what Barbara Honegger Britton says, it had to apply because of him. But the real nature of the NSC is that it's not in the real government. It's in the shadow government. It's there behind the lines. It's the government that operates in secret. When Haig jumps up and Reagan's shot and Bush is out of town and somebody's got to take charge and there's a big fight, William French Smith and Haig and everybody's fighting down in the Situation Room, and Haig comes up and he says, "Gentlemen, I'm in charge here, right? Until the Vice President returns." Okay? And everybody said, "Geez, you know, he doesn't remember the 25th Amendment." I mean, they don't, these military guys, they don't even read the Constitution. I mean, this is the first time in history that they ever took the Fifth. An officer took the Fifth. I say if an officer can take the Fifth, an enlisted can take the First. Okay? But we haven't got to that one yet. But they don't know what the Constitution. There's this great picture of Poindexter and North, and they're shredding the Constitution in the NSC, and the little piece on the floor, and North's down on his knees. He says, "I found it, the Fifth Amendment." It's the only one that counts. Okay, so, but they tell you it didn't apply, and everybody smirks. No, you think it didn't apply. It really did. The 25th Amendment doesn't apply. What applies is executive orders, secret military secession orders, Federal Emergency Management Agency takeover, regional control, National Guard takeover of state and local government. There are secret secession orders for crisis management. What's crisis management? It used to be called emergency preparedness. Well, it goes back to the McCarran Act in the 50s, times of national war, declared war, attack on the United States or its territories or possessions. Truman declared one at the time of Korea. It wasn't revoked until Kennedy. Kennedy declared one for the Cuban Missile Crisis. It wasn't revoked until Nixon. Nixon put one in for Vietnam. There were other ones later on. They're in effect. If they want to implement the rest, they can legally, but they have to have an excuse that someone's going to buy. Okay, so they have to come up with some reason to go to the martial law. They're just tomorrow, okay, now it's martial law. But 2 days before Reagan was shot, in March of '81, there was a switchover between Haig and Bush as who was going to head crisis management. And it was this phony thing, actually, but they pretend they were fighting over it, and then Reagan chose Bush over Haig. And then 2 days before, they said to him in the press conference, to Bush, they said, "What is a crisis? You're just chosen to head crisis management. What is a crisis?" He said, this is a quote from Bush, "The president will know it when he sees it." And he got it. That's the answer. You'll know it when you see it. If you look, Army spy unit lacked controls. Let's suppose that it wasn't the CIA, but the DIA. Over here, them? Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, the largest spy network in the United States, DISC, Defense Industry Security Command, the largest internal police force in the United States, the branch intelligences, a budget, a personnel 10 times as large and as secret, organizations like the NRO, classified to even mention the initials, National Reconnaissance Organization, the Satellite Intelligence, every electronic communication. They declassify so much paper every day in the NSA that they take it to the basement and burn it in the furnace to heat the rest of the building. All right? This is the spy agency, and they talk in here about a secret, ultra-secret Army intelligence group, intelligence support activity, yellow fruit that Oliver North is involved with, when a military order may be disobeyed in a separate command, perhaps, a counterterrorism unit, a policy and operations subgroup of the NSC, Secord led a secret... Yeah, you can come up afterwards and get them, Richard. These are in the papers out here, in the Chronicle and different places, the Mercury. Secord led secret counterterrorism unit. Retired Air Force officer bypassed official controls. When two people come from the Pentagon into the NSC, and they don't have to tell the president what's going on, they figure it's better not to let him know, and they begin to make the internal, domestic, and foreign policy decisions on martial law, on relations with Iran, that's military coup d'etat. When everybody breathes a sigh of relief, oh, Reagan didn't know. Reagan didn't know. Reagan wasn't even on need to know. Okay? I mean, Reagan just wear your boots, go out with Nancy. What's the difference, you know? Oh, I mean, what's the difference? He doesn't need to know except what they tell him. So who's in charge? Someone else. They come in, and who opposes them? Who's the only one that opposes them in the NSC at the beginning? Not McFarlane or Schultz. Schultz comes in to replace Haig, remember? When Haig is dumped out after the little brouhaha in March of '81. And he's the loyalist now. You know, Schultz defends Reagan, blah, blah, blah. You know, he's the other side. But it was Richard Allen. And what happened to Richard Allen? Because he and William Clark were the ones that first invited North and Poindexter in. There was a scandal. Do you remember? There was Japanese money in a safe, and they'd given it to Nancy for a visit with Nancy, and he put it in the safe. And if you listen to Robert Owen's testimony, he said, Ollie and I used to joke about it because the money for Ollie used for the Contra stuff, we kept it in Richard Allen's safe. That same safe. Ha, 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 ha. I went back to the Richard Allen stories in my clip file. Who was it in the NSC that discovered the scandal money in the safe? Oliver North. Took him out and began to make the decisions at the top. So look to military intelligence. CIA is fairly lame at this point. You can put William Webster in, you know, switch him over from the FBI. And what did this team do once they were in? Reagan aides in the secret government. This is the Miami Herald, an absolutely important piece. Not all of it got into the version in the San Jose Mercury. Out here, a very important paragraph didn't get in. I'll read it to you. About North's first duties when he came into the NSC. About this same time, this is '81, North completed his transfer to the NSC from the Marine Corps. Those who worked with North in 1981 remember his first assignments as routine, though not unimportant. North, they recalled, was briefly assigned to carry the football, the briefcase containing the secret contingency plans for fighting nuclear war, which is taken everywhere the president goes. North later widened his assignment to cover national crisis contingency planning. In that capacity, he became involved with the controversial plan drafted by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was the martial law plan. The football disappeared in Dallas for 3 hours after John Kennedy was shot, while they planted the Oswald the Red story in the press, lest anyone not on need to know in the military overreact and begin an attack on the Soviet Union. Not only was the football missing, and lest someone like Kennedy survive and respond in that fashion, not only was the football missing, but every SAC bomber in the air, as well as Air Force 2 bringing the cabinet back from the Philippines, were missing the military intelligence code books inside the secret locker on each plane necessary to decode the fail-safe messages from the president or anywhere else in the command and control modules. I've talked to pilots who told me every book was gone from every bomber in the air, and it's in Pierre Salinger's book that it was gone from there. The box disappears March 31, '81 when Reagan is shot. A fellow named Morales is in the films that you saw on TV. He hits the deck in military uniform. He jumps back up when the shooting's done, and he runs away from the limousine. He's gone for about 3 or 4 hours. He shows back up without the box to collect the magnetic card from Reagan's wallet, stripped from him as he went into the trauma room from the FBI, by the FBI. The FBI have the card. It's like a little magnetic tape to stick into the box to give the orders to identify you as the president. The FBI are holding it. Secret Service show up, along with Morales, to get it back. FBI call headquarters. Headquarters call Webster. Webster's in the Situation Room. Webster says, hold on to it. Who's in charge of the Command and Control Communications Center at the White House Situation Room that hour, if even the box and the card had been reunited? Helena von Daum, sitting at the controls. Helena von Daum, the personal secretary to Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing. Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing, the direct superior to Adolf Eichmann in the Einsatzgruppen, the kill teams, the mobile teams in Europe, his personal translator in the 1950s when he comes to the United States. She and von Bolschwing are the key founders of a corporate front for the CIA in Southern California called TCI, Transnational Computer Investments. TCI employs Edwin Wilson, the arms dealer, tied in with the current Contragate people, and much of the arms movement of the CIA. TCI's board of directors eventually will include John Paul Getty II, Emmanuel Fithnakis, a Greek fascist from IT&T. Top money people in the ruling class in this country through this corporate front that's run for years. The attorney who drafts the papers in 1956 to incorporate TCI for von Bolschwing and Helena von Damme is Arthur Lyman from the Simon Rifkin Fund, who sits on the committee now and asks supposedly pertinent questions of the witnesses. That company in 1970 folds, goes bankrupt. Its main subsidiary, International Imaging Systems, is sold to two people, Albert Hakim and Richard Secord. The company becomes Stanford Technology International and Stanford Technology Trading Group International with Secord and North. And they employ Frank Turple, the other half of the Wilson team. All right. Helena von Damme in the 50s leaves TCI along with von Bolschwing. Von Bolschwing goes into the Operation Division of the CIA to replace Hitler's top intelligence agent for the Eastern Division, General Reinhard Gehlen, who, with 350 Nazi spies, based on a deal he made with Allen Dulles in 1943, came into the United States and formed the Central Intelligence Agency Operation and Spy Covert Division with the same Nazi spies that were used in the Soviet Union, against the Soviet Union at that time. Had cross-infiltrated the KGB, were interlinked through the Black Orchestra with British intelligence, were part of a world intelligence group that had consolidated and cross-infiltrated by the end of that time. He goes back, Gehlen, this top spy who formed our CIA, goes back to form NATO intelligence, the BND in Germany, and French, post-war French intelligence. Von Bolschwing replaces him here, and Helena von Damme becomes personal secretary in California to the aspiring young Governor Ronald Reagan. She stays with Reagan into the White House. In the White House, she becomes the appointment secretary for the whole cabinet. She's appointed ambassador to Vienna. She's scandalized out of that position. Her husband, Christian von Damme, is the president of Bank America in La Paz, Bolivia, which launders the money for Klaus Barbie and the Handmaidens of Death for the cocaine sales up through DeLorean and for the financing of the Contras and the Contragate operation. Helena von Damme is who knows where at this moment. Ronald Reagan, we know where he is. Otto von Bolschwing and Gehlen have thankfully passed, but not with any help from U.S. intelligence or many of us. I have a kind of late picture of von Bolschwing, but this team is the center. Secord, the attorney who sets up all of the accounts internationally for the enterprise, Mr. Zucker, is the attorney that handles the papers of the switchover from TCI to Stanford Technology. He's also a law partner for many years in the firm of Mr. Walsh, the special prosecutor, who's now coming in. Mr. Walsh himself began his political career in the offices of none other than Thomas Dewey, the CIA mafia candidate in Orwell's year 1948, Big Brother himself. His campaign manager was Allen Dulles. He was scheduled to win, and Truman pulled it out from under with the electoral vote. His vice presidential running mate in 48 on the CIA mafia money, none other than Earl Warren, later to head up the cover-up in the investigation of the John Kennedy assassination. Thomas Dewey, after the election, is hired by Shenley Distilleries, the mob and CIA-tied money up in Toronto, and has life funds there. Who's Walsh's legal working partner in the Dewey firm when he starts in the 50s? William P. Rogers, part of the Nixon administration, scandalized by the Lum mob money in the late 1960s and early 70s, and more recently appointed to investigate the explosion of the shuttle Challenger, when I believe U.S. military blew it up in order to take total military control of all space operations in the United States, and to wipe out what was left of the 60s astronauts, the two Vietnam vets, the only Jewish woman, the only blacks and Asians, and put in the right stuff again. So they could get back on target with all the rest of the NASA Nazis, hundreds of whom came here with Werner von Braun and are still there, and they're crying because a few of them, like Mr. Rudolph, have had to be deported from the United States. Nobody even mentioned the crimes. They set him up to live out his life in Portugal before they made it public that they knew he was a war criminal. They let him out of the United States and arranged for his escape from any justice or trials. But the LaRouche Group and others begged to have Mr. Rudolph returned and to have the big Star Wars program start up, as though putting 2 on the moon were worth sending 13 million to hell. That's what those rockets are worth. And that's what the guy who protected them when they came in said, well, we got them over here and they built our rockets and they did a good job for us. So what did they do with the money? They set up a secret government. The money's still there. It's not Casey had this idea. The money's still there. The secret government is still in place, still operating. And they began to kill people, not only all the genocide in the Third World, but also people connected to the scandal. Here's Mother Jones, Contragate witness deaths. One of the early bidders who competed with Khashoggi, Cyrus Hashemi, dies strangely, diagnosed as a leukemia that's only existed as a disease for 2 days. Contra arms case witness dies of cocaine overdose, Stephen Carr, one of the drug runners down on the border. When the connections between this network and another interlink of drug runners and drug smugglers and gun runners and international Quintney, the connections with Nugan Hand, one of the bankers from the United States sitting on the Senate Intelligence Committee makes the mistake the day it becomes news of mentioning that he's very concerned about the financial ties that Ollie North apparently had. His name is Edward Zirinsky. He was a senator from Nebraska. The next day he was dead of a heart attack. That's a connection that's not allowed to come out because that's all of the opium and heroin money from Southeast Asia.
Replaced by a pro-Reagan Republican.
Yes, I'm sure. Why not? Okay. Thank you. The murder of Ben Lindner and the many, many people in Central America. The indigenous populations that are killed there day in and day out, tens of thousands. Here's an article, North urged leniency for a Honduran link to an assassination plot. The plot to kill Ambassador Tams, although he did all right in the witness stand. I don't know why they wanted to get him out, but he might have stood in the way of something. They'll kill their own. Magazine says that the investigating committees kept a death watch on Casey. The CIA PR woman said, that's disgusting. Not as disgusting as what they do.
How do they cause heart attacks?
I can talk about it. We'll wait for questions. Just a minute. This is Ahmed Galil, the fellow who brought the bomb to the La Peña Eden Pastora press conference. Lapenka, I'm sorry. Where the journalists were bombed and there was the attempt to kill Eden Pastora. I noticed this week he's been invited back into Nicaragua by the Sandinistas. And that story is the one that broke the other connections. Plots to kill U.S. Costa Rican envoy. Americans working with the mercenaries there, the Soldier of Fortune groups. It's Soldier of Fortune and Posse Comitatus and the Klan and the right-wing paramilitary squads that are recruited to become the replacement for the National Guard in the United States in the martial law plan. When the National Guard, which is the only remaining combat troops they feel they can trust, because their class and race structure is what they feel they need in the first wave into Central America, when they're taken out and sent down there, they have to be replaced here for the domestic control. And so part of the plan is to set up secret state defense forces. And the only people that have known about that until the Christie Institute revealed it and been recruited were people from these right-wing paramilitary groups. And they're the ones to round up the 400,000 Central American refugees and take them into the camps. This plan that they wrote up was based on a paper written in 1970 by Louis Gefrida. He's a friend of Mies and a friend of Turnage. He was part of Governor Reagan's first fascist plans here in California, Operation Golden Bear, Operation Cable Splicer, and the other ones for martial law here during the 60s that Ed Mies took part in. Gefrida became director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, taken out on a scandal, but he was in there for the period when North was the liaison between the NSC and FEMA making these plans, and he wrote a paper in 1970, the Army War College in Carlisle, PA, and that paper was used as the basis for the North Plan. And that paper discusses the roundup into assembly centers or concentration camps of 21 million Negro Americans.
Is that Rex 84?
That's the basis for Rex 84. Rex 84 is the North Plan, and the exercises. There were plans at the time of Kent State. There were 18 camps open at the time of Kent State. There were plans during the Vietnam War. There were lists that date back to the 1950s, Army intelligence, FBI, dragnet lists, plans down to the neighborhood level for the military pickup, military control of all the interstate highways and the large airports that comes immediately into effect, suspension of the Constitution and civil liberties, and FEMA's also setting up all the phony civil defense stuff. So they take one part of the population down into the shelters, and when you come back up, some people are missing. It's a good scenario. Nuclear terrorism, everybody's frightened. Abu Nidal has the bomb. Even Ollie's fence won't protect us. Wait, they'll build a bigger fence around all of us, then we'll feel safe. But there are a number of articles about the people that have died, the witnesses and other people. And then the third thing is this cocaine traffic. Cocaine is the drug for the 80s. It starts in the 50s with opium into heroin from the Bayer laboratories in Germany, the replacement reduction cure for morphine addiction. And then it goes through Southeast Asia, Bishop Montini, who becomes Pope Paul VI, running it for the OSS and the French ruling class, into Italy, the lab set up by Lucky Luciano, through Marseille, into New York, into Florida. Then the route moves into the Golden Triangle, Burma and Laos, the one that Bo Gritz is revealing in the last few weeks, with Khe Sanh and the big opium dealers there, and the Mao or Hmong tribes that were used as mercenaries and paid off in gold in exchange for the opium they grew. The raw opium stuffed into the dead bodies of returning servicemen and flown into San Francisco, broken down in labs in Thailand owned by the Pepsi-Cola Company and Richard Nixon, never produced a bottle of Pepsi. Outlined in the book Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, and in the follow-up book Great Heroin Coup. The move after the death of the Golden Triangle and the end of the Vietnam War into Turkey, into the Middle East, into the Bekaa Valley, which is the site of all the contention about the Palestinians. The two brothers, Gemayel brothers, that came in there for a while in Lebanon, the top opium dealers, and into Afghanistan, where the opium was exchanged for guns. And
this is the end of side 2.
This is KPFK Los Angeles. We're listening to John Judge. John Judge, speaking in July 1987. We continue.
It continues through these routes and then into Bolivia, and Klaus Barbie and the Joseph Mengele banking accounts, which is where the John DeLorean money is taken. Afterwards, when Mengele is supposed to be dead, the Nazis running the cocaine, because the opium has run out. They can't keep the addicts alive in sufficient enough population. It decreases, and they can make more money. They've used the profit off of the opium, so they go to cocaine. The graffiti in the bathroom is, cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money. And then the next thing that they come into, besides interrelating with all this opium and drug traffic and running it and benefiting off of it and paying for themselves, is what Barbara Honecker Britton has been trying to get out, who worked for the Reagan administration for a number of years before she resigned, which is the manipulation through DebateGate and the theft of the briefing books by Sven Kramer, the son of Fritz Kramer, a top lieutenant to Hitler, who was in the Pentagon Plans Division and the NSC for 30 years and didn't go in the overchange when they bring Carlucci, who protected Secord during the Egyptian arms scandal, in to clean up the NSC. He didn't take out Sven Kramer or any of the key people. They make a few cosmetic changes and they continue the operation, but they steal the debate books. The second thing they do is they send McFarlane and Armitage and these other key figures in the administration, the October Surprise Group, down to meet with either Ghorbanifar or Rafsanjani or some Iranian moderate to make a deal for arms in 1980 so that the embassy hostages will not be released prior to the election in 1980, so that Carter can have no credit And in fact, they're released on Inauguration Day, except for the one phony hostage left behind, Cynthia Dwyer, who was planted by the CIA to be left behind. They've milked it for all, day number 368 of the hostage crisis. They've waved the flag long enough. They've gotten what they want, and so it's time to bring them home, but not too soon. So we give them arms that time to hold the hostages and wait until Reagan comes in and then release them. In the beginning of Irangate 1. And the other thing they set up, the same team, Colonel Gadd and Dutton and Secord and North, is Eagle Claw or Desert One, the operation to rescue the hostages. They take defective choppers off the USS Enterprise and they fly them into the desert with five C-130 planes to refuel them, 8 helicopters. Have you ever seen a C-130? You could put the 8 helicopters in one of them, along with the fuel. 5 huge planes to fuel 8 helicopters. No, 5 planes to land 800 miles from Tehran, at the border of Afghanistan, near a public road that goes into Afghanistan, where trucks come down to the operation, unload the guns, load the opium, blow up the helicopters, embarrass Carter, and in a second way, make sure for Reagan's election. So this is what the bombshell that's likely to come out next. The pieces of it are starting to break. This may be the one that they can actually take Reagan out with the least amount. But the money's still there. Tower says arms proceeds vanished into a black hole. That's the Tower Commission. Well, Tower ought to know where arms proceeds go. His brother-in-law for many, many years is Samuel Cummins, who runs Inter-Armco, the largest CIA drug and gun running operation in the world. It's where Wilson and Turple funneled all their guns through. It was that company that provided the phony batch of Mannlicher Carcanos to Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago and sent one to the phony P.O. box supposedly owned by Lee Harvey Oswald so it could become the murder weapon, so-called, in the John Kennedy assassination. And Tower votes always with the military-industrial complex, but even he notices that the money is gone. And then the 10 million slides around. They never name the shipping magnate who gets it. That's an important name nobody asked for. Which person 3 or something. And the Contra funds are then used by North in secret projects. And there's a plan to have an ongoing secret thing. But they're so concerned that the Contras don't have enough money that they use the Iran funds in their lawsuit to defend themselves against the Christic Institute, poor Contras, because they've given up on the Contras, which is the next level, that Schultz is talking about. Well, if we can't do it by the surrogates, then the U.S. is going to have to get tough and actually go to war. Okay. The Newton-Hand connection is also important and drawn out a little bit, and the Edwin Wilson connection ties them back into TCI and this gun running. So all these major operations that were slight window openings interconnect with North, including Abu Nidal, through that period. And then the Christic suit is bringing out what's called the secret team, and they name the defendants, and they have an organized crime thing going back 25 years. It's not far enough, and they don't name enough people, but it's a real good attempt to at least start to say that these people just didn't an aberration, somebody forgot a memo. It has secret team linked with the Iran scandal, and it's starting to come out who is Singlov and the connections with the assassinations and the drugs and the killing teams and the real background of what these guys are doing. And Singlov is tied in with the International Fascist Network of the World Anti-Communist League, which is where all these Nazis went internationally, and includes all of the so-called resistance forces around the world that are trying to keep fascism in or put it back in control. Here's other links to the right wing. Evidence points towards North's ties to Reverend Moon. LaRouche says North and the NSC helped to get him indicted. Questions on the $100,000 that were given to the Heritage Foundation by the AIDS, or by them to the AIDS. What happened to that? The Africa connection to the Kirkpatrick Doctrine and the policy in Africa. South Africans with CIA aid helped the Contras. The money's from the international fascists. Iran arms profits paid to kidnappers and other operations. The death squads, the money going into continued operation. North may have used a youth group in the Contra fund network that ties into the international right wing. The Hoover Institution chief is linked to North in a document. That's a right-wing think tank out here in California. And here, just for a little bye-bye, is Otto von Bolschwing breathing the last of his oxygen in the San Jose Mercury a few months before he dies. The only natural deaths that anyone's are allowed to have are the Nazis to get to be 80 years old. I hope any of us last so long. Honduras says it downed a drug plane. Now, this isn't the Hassenfuss plane, but it could have been. There's all these secret bases right on the Honduran border revealed just recently. It might have been the 16-year-old kid, and they should give him a medal for the surface-to-air missile, but it might have been orchestrated to the point of bringing down the plane. They blew up Gary Powers' plane, and he knew it, in order, the U-2 in the 50s, in order to sabotage Détente. They blew up KL-007, not the Soviets. They were on course. They weren't over Soviet airspace. They blew them up simultaneously. They listened to the radio till the Russian pilot targeted the stealth spy plane, the AWAC plane that we actually sent in on this parallel course to light up their radar, and Ollie North had control, it says in this Miami Herald article, of where all the satellite spying would be in the world, and he could turn the satellites around to look at things, and they were looking at the Soviet defense and air radar systems light up because they were about to do an ICBM test, and this plane goes in, and he comes in and he says, the target is destroyed. Remember the quote? Well, for a pilot, target is destroyed doesn't mean that he came behind the plane, fired a missile, watched it go into the plane, watched the plane blow up, and followed it till it was all done. When you shoot the missile with the electronic equipment, you veer off because you don't want to keep running into the explosion. So you veer off, and you say the target's destroyed means you have it in sight, and you push the missile, and presumably the electronics go. But with stealth, your electronics tell you the plane is somewhere else. So he fires the missile, and they hit the detonator on KL-07, 300 nautical miles away, blow up the plane, have, I believe, a phony death for Larry McDonald. 6 people didn't get back on the plane. I think he was enough in the know not to get on it. And they're able to get chemical biological warfare back the next day. In the Congress, they stop opposing the military budget. We go back to calling the Soviets the barbaric empire. And so downing a plane may have started this one as well. The loyalists come in this week like Poindexter and North, and they're so transparent that everybody can tell, that they're setting it up to fall apart. And they're supposed to be protecting the president, but it's very, very open. And these people know each other, but the key figure, I think, is this fellow depicted in the cartoon here in a state of pregnancy, George Bush. It says, it really belongs to Mr. Reagan, I'm just the surrogate. And the little bird who always has the last word says, that's what we'll call it, surrogate. This is Bush 88 headquarters on the moon. The guy says, think this is far enough distant from the Contra affair? But he's moving from behind the scenes. He's the one with the Teflon coat. He's got $9.4 million in the Treasury this week to run the election. He's still leading the Republican polls. He's quite chummy with this little group known as the Knights of Malta, a secret group within the top levels of the Catholic Church money. William Casey was part of it. Reinhard Galen, James Angleton, Cartha Dick DeLoach from the FBI, Claire Booth Luce, J. Peter Grace, James Buckley. A lot of the top ambassadors and officials. Haig and his brother are members. Mies, meanwhile, is in trouble. It's the first scandal that they present to divert us from the testimony is Tammy Baker and Jimmy, and the sex and the church and Pearlygate. And so we'll watch that and not the hearings, But then it comes out after a little bit that the payoff money to Jessica Hahn through the church had to be laundered and funneled through WedTech, the corporation where Mies is involved in the ethics scandal. Okay, so the money comes through the same route and does the same thing. There is a national impeachment coalition, and I like their button at least. It says impeach Bush, Meese, and Reagan. You know, and take the three of them out and go for the drug scandal. But the head of now is calling for impeachment, and a lot of people say let's impeach, but you've got to take it a little further. March 31, 81, the button I had on that day when I heard over the radio that Reagan was shot said shoot Bush first. I didn't mean that, Secret Service. I'm an alleged comedian. That's a Paul Krasner joke. And then North goes into the Marines. North, there's plans, secret plans. North sought Nicaragua-U.S. confrontation, an Alamo showdown, a big CIA base reported on the Honduran border. The FBI is investigating threats against political activists, death squads against Latino and Hispanic women in the support and solidarity community for Central America movement within the last 2 weeks in Los Angeles and out here on the West Coast. And I'm sure that will spread, unfortunately. North's other secret scheme, the plan to intervene with U.S. troops in Nicaragua. I've seen the troops die, and this Marine, for one, would never send anyone. These medals don't belong to me, they belong to my dead men from Vietnam. Well, why are you wearing them? If they could get back. I knew those Second Louis. All through the war, you know, the ones that sent them in out into the kill zones and got the grenades from the rear. For a while there, the paratroop medics lasted longer than the Second Louis. But North got through somehow. Torture and slayings by the Hondurans charged. Secret bases found on the Honduran border. The Honduran government doesn't know. U.S. sources say CIA aided Honduran death squads. Schultz says U.S. may get tough if Contras are abandoned. All the Solidarity Movement groups are read off during the hearing as having nonprofit status, and they're funding the other side, and they're arming the FMLN, and they're just Ollie North and left drag, you know, by these senators. So the IRS attack. The Contras say U.S. enables regular resupply flights in the Pentagon Republic of the Honduras. Do you know what all these articles mean? War. The little dirty secret. The one that goes on forever. The one that the veterans know and could tell you if they could speak, if they survive. 110,000 suicides since the end of Vietnam. More, almost twice as many as died during the war, already gone. Just to suicide. Not counting Agent Orange, I'm not counting alcohol and drug abuse, the deaths from the overdoses. Just deaths that could be ruled suicide by the VA, or none too careful. Okay. And they're ready now to take the next generation and to do what needs to be done. And that's what this switchover will mean when George Bush comes, is the escalation into open fascism and third world genocide. Unless people wake up, stand up, speak up, and begin to address in their own lives their sanction of this by their silence or their cooperation, their open compliance with this, and the level to which these oppressions, which are not apart from the racism and sexism and class problems that pervade every aspect of the society, these are just some of its symptoms. But unless those begin to be addressed, not just up at this arcane level of political gossip I'm talking about, but at the home front, in the home, in the neighborhood, at the workplace, in the political organizations that we belong to, unless we begin to address those changes for ourselves, the larger changes won't come and fascism will. And it's not that far. 5 years ago, Ben Jones, the researcher who studied 175 deaths, mysterious deaths connected to the murder of John F. Kennedy, at a party mentioned to someone that he felt it was like 1937 now in Nazi Germany. And a woman broke in and interrupted, and she said, "Now, just a minute, a personal friend of mine is Mr. William Shearer." He wrote the book Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. She said, he says it's 1938. We haven't got much breathing room by my analysis. On the other hand, we have much more capacity in this country to do something about it than people do in many other countries who are already under the open fascist rule. And we have more time, we have more resources, but unless we begin to address it in our own lives and how we treat each other, then we can't successfully address it elsewhere, because they will divide us with that, and they will manipulate us with that, and they will break us with that, which is what they did all through the 60s and 70s with COINTELPRO and Chaos and the other programs that were aimed at destroying the movements in this country. And until those movements address some of these issues in how they organize, how they operate, how they lead, then things won't change enough, because we're replicating the conditions that breed the fascism. And the history of the resistance of World War II was an indigenous resistance against indigenous fascism. And that history has yet to be told in many countries of the world. All the fascists weren't Germans, and all the Germans weren't fascists. And many of the fascists existed elsewhere and collaborated elsewhere and were driven out elsewhere. But the ultimate victory was lost when the United States intervened and helped the Odessa and the Kameradenwerk and the Spinne and the different groups of the Nazi war criminals move across the world and into the United States and into positions of power, helped through Operation Bernhard for them to move their gold and their art treasures and to print foreign currency and to set themselves back up in South America and Central America and in the United States and in South Africa and in countries all over the world where the fascism continued. And that fascism is going to sprout in the way that Malcolm X said it would, that the chickens have come home to roost, that the war is home now. And it's the war against all of us, unless we can wake up to where we live and where we are. And someone said to me the other day, this isn't Nazi Germany, who are the Jews? Well, some of the Jews are still the Jews. You don't see any Jews at the top levels of the government. Don't point Henry Kissinger out to me, please. He's not Jewish. If you get his real background, you'll find out that, his story about his family and running. This was the cover that Galen gave all of his operatives that penetrated the Soviet Union, was that they were Jews that were running from Hitler. It was a cover story. He worked with Fritz Kramer, with Lucien Clay, with General Siex and Berthardt, the Nazi war criminals. He was in the 917th Counterintelligence Corps that moved the Odessa. He was in the CIA units here in the United States that helped to integrate them into our intelligence communities. He collaborated with the fascists and was part of them all the way through. But you go to the country clubs and you go to the top levels of government, it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that you're going to find there, almost without exception in this country, in the real ruling class circles. And then they say, where are the camps? Well, there are camps. There's slave labor here in the United States. It's hidden under the corporate fronts, on the privately owned farms, in certain industries, but it's here, if people took the time to look at it. It's in the institutions, the prisons, the psychiatric prisons, the legal prisons that are our third world, that everyone turns their face and attention away from. It's in the VA, where people are used 80,000 a month as human guinea pigs to test the drugs and the new techniques for the medical and psychiatric facilities. It's out in the streets where the homeless are, not caged, but let to die, let to be surplus population, let to be useless eaters. It's not picked up and put into the oven. It's oven dropped out of the sky, white phosphorus and napalm in Vietnam and El Salvador and the countries where they attack. It's still genocide. It's still aimed at the same targets, and it still comes in the end to the same thing. And should power ever shift on this globe, should this ever not be 6% of the population consuming 60% of the energy and 30% of the resources of the world, and should we ever be held accountable, ask yourself honestly, how different will the testimony be from that of those fascists in Nuremberg at the end of World War II? How different from the testimony of Contragate, that I was only following orders, I did what I was told, I was supporting freedom, you know, murder, sabotage, death in the name of freedom, anything in the name of freedom, someone's freedom somewhere, certainly not the people under the gun, but for their version of freedom and their version of democracy, which means class privilege, as opposed to their version of communism, which means democracy and democratic control and real rights and destiny for people to control their own lives. It's there, it's under the surface, but it's a particular brand of American chauvinism that says it can't happen here. Somebody get me something to drink? Could I get something to drink? Thanks. Thanks a lot, Dee. I'll try a few questions. My voice is almost dead. Yeah, in the back. The main purpose of Vietnam? It's hard for me to separate one. In 1952, Eisenhower spoke to the American Businessmen's Association. He said there was nowhere else in the world we could get tungsten in such quantity, and that it was worth sending $4 billion a year to the French to fight it and to support them and to replace them eventually when we came in. In 1954, the petroleum trade magazines revealed that the offshore coast of Vietnam had more oil in the early drilling exploration than the Texas Panhandle. And by the end of the war, when the corporate enterprises fell, there were 99-year leases going all the way down the coast from Exxon, and it was rubber, because that sector, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, cut the United States off when it was under Japanese control of the Pacific Rim from 98% of the rubber, and the tires had to be retreaded, and you know, there was rubber rationing. That's how, in fact, George Smathers and Bebe Rebozo and eventually Richard Nixon in the Office of Price Controls profiteered much of their personal fortunes, was on tire smuggling and rubber control. So it was resources in that region. It was political control to maintain post-World War II world hegemony over those areas. So we beefed the French up until they fell at Dien Bien Phu. Nixon wanted nuclear weapons to go back in. And they settled instead for the U.S. replacing, Eisenhower blocked him, in fact, settled for the U.S. replacing the French, taking over the paid mercenaries of the French, and trying to fight the war there themselves. It was profit, because this is an economy geared to war. It's a permanent war economy. It survives primarily on either carrying out wars from here or paying for and promoting wars and selling the weapons internationally to those people. Thanks a lot. Okay, so it was profit. It was testing weapons, new technologies on the field that they had developed in order to carry it out. It was medals for the field promotions, for the officers in the military. And it was genocide, and it was ethnocide, destruction of the culture, and it was ecocide, destruction of the ecology, to send a permanent message to anyone in the third world who would try, as Nicaragua later did, as Chile later did, to set up anything outside the confines of that control, to set up democracy. It was a terrible message, a message that left the rice production capital of the world importing all of its rice, that brought bubonic plague to pandemic levels in Vietnam that hadn't been seen since the Middle Ages, spread by the rats, that so destroyed the natural trophic and food chain levels that rats and tigers would run toward the sound of gunfire and bombs because they knew bodies would churn up or fall on the ground to eat. It became a nightmare unimaginable. More tonnage of bombs dropped on that small country about the size of Massachusetts than were used in all the wars of the 20th century. Combined, both sides, both forces, World War I, World War II, Korea. It meant an 89% civilian death ratio to armed force, which outstripped anything that they had seen before. And actually, that and the napalm were the two main reasons that my mother sickened and began to tell me the secrets inside the Pentagon that she had found while she worked for them. And at the end, admitted to me that she had learned one lesson in the 30 years for sure, and that's that standing armies don't stand, they move. I'm looking for a woman's hand. In the back.
My comment is about our frustration when we came back and the craft officer, that plane, except craft officer. I brought them back to the cyanide 18 before. But then Colonel Martin Jeffco, when I was in rent from Virginia, said he was the commander of that, and I remember reading about it. So correct me if I'm wrong. Am I right to say that?
I think the plane was there from there, Pierre, but if you remember, there was a diversion of the troops in both directions, and if you remember this Corporal Alfred Griffin, who refused to go, a Muslim, black Muslim, and at first they wanted to send him to Beirut, and he said, no, I won't kill other Muslims, and then they said, well, all right, go to Grenada, and he said, no, I won't kill other blacks. But there was a diversion of those same units in and out. One of the groups got blown up there at the Beirut thing, and then some of that Marine Amphibious Unit and the 101st that were there were moved into the Grenada operations as well.
Okay.
So that's why I believe they were connected.
One of my questions are,
But in any case, I think they at that point distrusted the race composition of the whole 101st, whether they'd been to Grenada or not.
what can you tell us about Richard Beale, Dr. Richard Beale, the Special Assistant to the President on Crisis Management, part of the National Security Council. And what can you tell us about the background on John Paul 23rd?
I couldn't get the first name.
Dr. Richard Beale, the Special Assistant on Crisis Management.
I don't know that one. I know Koch, but I mean, these crisis management people have to be on the innermost levels of the game, and they're the people that are going to run the country when they have the switchover, and so they have to be among the most trusted of the troops. I'm sorry to say, know that particular name. Was he in FEMA or DOD?
He was on the National Security Council. He does
NSC.
Of a Triple Heart, Triple Heart coronary.
Okay.
And he was credited for having put Reagan in the White House with the CIA money. Now, this is my own research, and I'm not sure if I can prove it. But he developed expert systems designed for President Richard Works on how to canvass the country and what issues to address, what ethnic group, and what regional composition, and with a delay factor after Carter had been there. So it was this expert system he helped develop, and what I believe was funding for that. So I was wondering if you knew anything more about it. He was in the office, White House Office Planning and Evaluation in the early 80s.
Oh, I know more about him now. As far as John Paul XXIII, I felt that he was an honest force that came into the Vatican and created quite a schism. And I think that John Paul VI was meant to replace him and change the direction of the Church and escalate it. John Paul XXIII's protege was John Paul II. Well, John Paul I was a protege of John the 23rd. John Paul I, the one that lasted about 30 days. And he came in and he said he might change the ruling on birth control. And he was opening some questions about abortion. And he wanted to get the Freemasons out of the Vatican, which was the secret Italian fascist group that was working with the Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta. And so as soon as he was dead, there was an ascendancy of these groups. And John Paul II, the current pope, came in. His background is his family name is Wojtyla. He's from Oswiecim, which was later called Auschwitz, in Poland. He worked at Auschwitz as a supervisor for the rubber factory there run by Solvay Chemical, which was Intergesellschaft Farben, IG Farben. He's regularly referred to in the Vatican circles as the Auschwitz Pope. He was not slave labor. His boss was Hermann Apps, who was the Nazi finance minister who was above Hjalmar Schacht in the international financing. Apps was so influential that Shawcross, the British prosecutor at Nuremberg, who wanted to hang many of these Nazis, had Apps as his personal banker and would visit him in his cell and laugh congenially with him and bring him dinners and things like that. And when the Vatican money scandal broke with Sindona and Calvi and the Vatican millions, the Pope appointed, John Paul II Pope appointed a 4-person committee to study the scandal, and he appointed Herman Apps as one of the members. And then even the Wiesenthal Center said something like, you know, well, this guy was a Nazi, wasn't he? And he said, oh, well, I didn't remember who he was, but he had been his boss years before. So, I mean, you'd certainly remember the commandant, wouldn't you? I mean, you know, even if you weren't one of the Jews who was being oppressed. And it's interesting, too, that that family adopted a child there, a Polish child whose mother and father were killed, and raised him, named Roman Polanski, who figures in later in the Sharon Tate murders. And when he got in trouble for sleeping with Natasha Kinski because she was 14 or something, and there were these charges, he ran back to Poland to visit the family there, and then went to see the Pope in Rome, because that was the family that raised him. It's in his autobiography, Roman, by Polanski. But he fits in later. So he was the protege of Montini, the drug-running Pope, from the 50s, and he ain't no good. You should get the book In God's Name by David Yallop if you want to understand the politics. Pat?
At the meeting, the public meeting to oppose the home berthing of the SS Missouri, I asked the Navy whether they agreed, and I want to ask your opinion, that if the American people gathered together, millions and millions of us, and we came anywhere near stopping the enormous profits of the defense industry made, do you think that the Navy and the Army and the military would turn their guns against the American people? Is that possible?
I think in some sense those guns are already turned, though not by the GIs. I think that the level of radiology I saw a study once that suggested that from the mining to the tailing to the separation of the bomb-grade uranium to the production of a bomb, that in all those processes from the ground to the bomb, more radiation is released into the biosphere than will be released when the bomb is detonated. So in that sense, the huge nuclear arsenal, maybe not with all the same levels of the deadly plutonium, but certainly toxic radiation, have already spread into the biosphere without the bombs being detonated. The testing that they do on GIs and on other people with the toxins that they create, the level of energy that and finances that I mean, how many people die each day because of the disproportionate level of the military budget as opposed to social cuts and any kind of human needs. And so I think that in that sense, those guns are the guns of the National Guard that have intervened in strikes, or the guns of the Guard in riots and other places. Those guns have been turned. But that military, you must remember, at the trigger level, is drawn now almost exclusively from the working class and the unemployed. It's a poverty draft now instead of a selective service draft. It's economic impressment that's forcing them in. And they don't have the class interest. They have some of the brainwashing from the military, but they don't have the class interest. There's large segments of black and Hispanic people in the military to turn those guns around. If they wouldn't do it in Grenada, they're much less likely to do it here. And many of those weapons are going to be dismantled by the GIs themselves once they're turned in that direction. But as far as the larger weapons and what they would do or foresee to do to all of us, the chemical biological warfare is already spreading. I believe that AIDS was developed at Fort Detrick, swine flu at Fort Dix, the Legionnaire's disease developed in the military labs, and these diseases are spread and tested throughout the populace with disastrous results. And so those guns, and the guns in the sense that we are all part of the world community that's being destroyed, have already been turned.
Hey, John, what do you believe that happened with the children in Iraq?
Well, I don't.
Was it the holes in the penises?
Dick Gregory has said some stuff about the interferon, and I could never get anything on it to have an opinion one way or the other. I mean, I don't. They can develop synthetic interferon, and I can't imagine them going to that length just for that, although it might have been a byproduct that some chemist said, well, as long as you're picking up the bodies, I have something I can do with it. Okay, I mean, that you usually when you do an intelligence operation, it's going to have several layers of use. Okay, and so it might have been plugged in on that level, but I don't think that to get interferon they were killing black children in Atlanta. I think the primary purpose was, just like other black murders are currently, since I've been here, I've been hearing about these shackle lynchings where they're shackling blacks' hands and their legs behind their back and hanging them from trees down in the surrounding communities here near the BART systems. And I mean, I think it's part and parcel of the ongoing racism and race genocide, and I think it was a specifically orchestrated series of killings, not done by this fellow Wayne Williams, who was set up as the patsy. Maybe they were testing something. I didn't see I haven't seen any of that evidence. I haven't seen the autopsy reports that mention the needle holes. I haven't seen an article about it. I've heard this, and I've heard Dick Gregory mention it, but I haven't seen it, so I don't have an opinion. You know, they were also doing mutilations on cattle during that period, and the genitals and the mouths. Maybe they were testing, viruses, for instance, usually attach themselves to one point on the body, like a rhinovirus, a cold virus. It doesn't come in through the skin on your hand. You have to put your hand to your nose. It comes in through the nose, okay? Or other, like a herpes, only comes in on the lips or the anus. Usually the viruses enter in relation to certain parts of the body or the flesh. And so maybe they were, testing some particular thing, or as I say, it might have been interferon and a chemical byproduct. I'm not denying it, but I'm just saying I don't think that they had to go to the length of killing. I mean, plenty of people die of other causes all the time. There's no reason to strangle them just to get interferon. So you could go to any more. Some type of testing that was involved with the AIDS. The thing that, of course, struck me about that, besides the fact that they set Wayne Williams up, was that the federal agency involved in the investigation was none other than the Center for Disease Control. Now, what did they have to do with the strangulation of black children in Atlanta? Is that a disease? I mean, it's a particular type of social disease, but it's not a disease and they're the main ones that study AIDS or study Legionnaire's disease. Now, I went back to the 50s and got the first issues of their morbidity and mortality reports, and the earliest reports about their inception as a federal agency. They weren't under NIH at that point, National Institute of Health. They were an adjunct to the Defense Department. They were part of an Office of Preparedness. Their ostensible purpose was to track morbidity and mortality rates to see if the Soviet Union or some enemy country was doing chemical biological warfare in the United States. And by what deaths and how they happened, they would figure that out. But that's nonsense. They weren't doing it. They didn't have the capacity to do it or to deliver it at that point. We were the ones that had the technology, and they were set up to track the experiments. So if they put a virus in the subway in New York, or they spray one from the boat in San Francisco, there's some way to track the deaths and find out what happened with the experiment. The Center for Disease Control, I found out after Cameroon, is also part of a special Pentagon team for international crises and mass death, any kind of a mass death situation. This team flies in from the U.S. It has medical doctors, all from the Pentagon, hand-picked, people from the Center for Disease Control, and so they were there in Cameroon looking at the bodies too. They show up in every one of the medical aspects that I'm suspicious of, and they were part of the Atlanta child deaths, so maybe they were testing something as well on the bodies. But I think that the main purpose was to, and it did very much so. I lived in Philadelphia and knew black families, and the children there were afraid to go out and play in Philadelphia. Just like Latino women connected with the Central American movement are afraid on the East Coast, not just the West Coast, of the death squads now, to have their name listed or something. I mean, it's just, and it was the same time there were stories in New York that they were ripping hearts out of black bodies, and there were just these different scare stories about blacks. And I think they keep up that level of fear to intimidate people. I mean, it's the same like the horrible stuff, the attacks against women, day in and day out, and they escalate that fear, and the solution they give you is let's have more police, let's have more surveillance, let's have more fascism, let's have less civil liberties, let's have longer prison sentences, and they go the opposite way rather than bringing it back down to a community solution, a political solution, a solution that addresses why these things happen, or challenges the misogyny, or challenges the virulent racism, you know, and moves to defend it. But until there's a joint response in white and black and Latino communities to these kind of attacks, until we begin to understand that we're all being attacked by the same system and for the same reason, and begin to link the issues together and understand that these aren't separate, isolated issues or separate, isolated attacks, then we can't address them, and we can't know what they are. But you may be right. I mean, it may be the interferon, but I think that was a side issue to the racism.
Do you have an opinion as to who, an individual, a family, a committee in this country or internationally is master planning this effort that manifests itself in all of these activities?
Well, it's a class. It's a class of concentrated wealth. It's about 2% of the population. Not all of them are this active. I mean, I am describing their hired guns, basically. No, they're a worldwide class. They're an international class. Yes, they exist and cooperate in many, many countries. They represent a continual concentration of the wealth. When that wealth concentrates to a certain point, segments of the population become expendable, because it continues to in this country. You have the idea that certain people won't have jobs, that it's okay, they won't have medical care, you know, and they'll be considered excess, useless eaters, Untermenschen, and they will be eliminated by letting them die or putting them in the institutions and killing them, you know, destroying their brains in psychiatric institutions, or killing them in the prisons or on the streets and attacking them. When it concentrates a little further, then the state becomes the corporation, and the corporation becomes the state. And that's Mussolini's definition of fascism, is corporatism. And at that point, when there's no separation between the government and the state, and all the state functions are to maintain and protect the profits and the international investments of the class, and the power is concentrated to that degree that there's no separation, then you have fascism on the economic level, and the populace becomes a commodity. And that's why you have labor camps. Because at that point, the remaining populace becomes a commodity like any other resource. And you use their labor till they drop, and then you take the gold from their teeth, and you take the hair from their head, and you make it back into profit as well. All right? And so it's capitalism's last stage is what fascism is. Because capitalism concentrates the wealth unevenly, and then it grows to the point that now 98% of the stocks and 50 to 60% of the land ownership in this country, and more all the time, because the farmers are going under, the big corporations are buying out the land, you know, the control of the resources and all the means of production are in fewer and fewer hands. And then you have within that only what remains now, I believe, prolonging our demise of the democracy, or the hint of democracy, the illusion at least, is that the class is fighting. Because when you come to that point of ultimate control in the martial law, they jockey for who will be on top. And so within that class there are segments. And within those segments there are segments. There's an old industrial investment class, the robber baron families, the families that made the original fortunes, the America's 60 families, Lundberg, the rich and the super rich, the power elite, C. Wright Mills, the Eastern establishment. Okay, the people that, when H.L. Hunt, who had more money than the Rockefellers, used to talk about it, said, when I go east, they treat me just like a stable hand. All right? It was an established investment capital group. They had their hands on key resources. They related to England and the European. They're Anglophiles. And the other money, the other major segment of the class, grew up at the end of World War II with speculation, speculative profit, and entrepreneurism in oil, land investment, land speculation, munitions, international arms sales, and the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1959, and shifted the power base into the southern rim. and aerospace, munitions, NASA, and that money, which took a large chunk of the tax dollars, okay, to get it started, but also speculated and had some international investment. It was basically entrepreneurial capital. And they disagree as to what point you have to pull the plug and go to open repression. And they fight. Usually the tickets, the presidential tickets, represent one person from either, like Reagan from one end, Bush from the other, you know, Kennedy from one end, Johnson from the other. You know, they represent that split. But then from time to time they fight, like Watergate or the Kennedy assassination, or certain shifts of power, Debategate, or what we see now, or Koreagate, and that's where they come from. Mr. Niels, who sits across from Mr. Lyman, investigated Koreagate under Leon Jaworski. Leon Jaworski was at Nuremberg. Leon Jaworski hid key witnesses and lost documents. He undermined the prosecution of key Nazis. He moved into the International Red Cross International Rescue Division. He was part of that segment when they provided the international ID along with the Vatican to move the Odessa. He went into J.M. Anderson Fund in Texas, 20 years in a CIA front company and Conduit Foundation. He was the special liaison for the Texas State Police to the Warren Commission investigation and covered up all the local investigations in the murder of Tippit and the reality behind the JFK assassination. And then, years later, he's the most trusted man in America to come in and tell us what Watergate is about and to save Nixon from absolute disaster and move Rockefeller and the others in. And then he comes into Koreagate again, and Niels is his right hand in the Koreagate. There's not a one of these. Walsh just took on 2 investigations this week. It was in the news. And one has to do, they took them over to the Justice Department and gave them to Walsh's office. And under what legal status, I don't know, because he's a special prosecutor for this thing, but one of them had to do with some Florida arms dealers and a big suit down there that's tied to the Contra case. And then the other one had to do with Southern Air Transport and flying some weapons elsewhere. Now I'm not remembering, but the two, it said there was no connection between the two situations except maybe that Southern Air had delivered the arms in both cases. It was 2 different countries. Maybe that was the connection. Well, Walsh admitted that it was his firm that drew up the contracts for the Southern Air shipments of the specific arms to the Contras run by North. They did the contracts for each flight. And he said there was no conflict of interest. Well, if you get it, there isn't. You see, there is no conflict of interest. They got the right guy there. All right? So if there was a conflict of interest, he'd be an honest force. But there's not a single one of the investigators that doesn't go back and represent the scandal. Inouye was the one who sat on the Watergate committee, and when Irvin said, "What's this Houston plan? Looks like martial law. It's fascist. I want to know more about it." Inouye said, "No, that's too sensitive. We can't talk about it." What did he say when Brooks tried to ask Ollie North about the martial law? He said, "That's too sensitive. We can't talk about it." That's what he's there for. He's the, in the office of Rudman, this guy Polgar defines 85 and 86 as the only years you can ask about. Polgar screens all of the CIA-sensitive testimony before it gets out on the floor. He worked with Operation Phoenix in Laos. He replaced Shackley, Klein, Secord, and North. When they left Laos for Chile to put Pinochet in, he came into their office, and so then he comes up and he defines the parameters of what the committee's going to ask about. And he's in Rudman's office. There's not a one, okay, of the investigators. You'd think, how many lawyers are there in this country? Enough, huh? You'd think they could get 6 or 8 that didn't have a connection to the scandal, but that's how they pick them. They have to have a connection to the scandal or they couldn't be the lawyer there. The minutes of the meeting where they chose the lawyers for the Warren Commission are still secret. What's so secret? How do you choose lawyers? And it said, these are special lawyers. They know about these things. They've done these kind of investigations before. Well, I bet they have. There's about 20 of them, and we pick out of them, so I get the same names come up. Gee whiz, F. Lee Bailey's going to do that case. Tammy and Baker, let's see, they went over to Melvin Belli. Wasn't that the attorney for Jack Ruby? Who's this attorney with North? Brendan Sullivan. Where's he work? Oh, Edward Bennett Williams. Wasn't he the attorney for John Hinckley? And the CIA, and What does this fellow Lyman do? Wasn't he the attorney for John DeLorean and Ivan Boesky and Robert Vesco and the international drug deals? Gee whiz, you know, you'd think they could find one. It's so bad that a researcher I knew, his daughter went to school, a little girl, and she said, well, my daddy is real important because he runs an embalming firm and he embalmed John F. Kennedy. Well, the researcher knew what that meant. Nobody was allowed to see those wounds unless they were on the in. You see, so they don't just send the body anywhere, you know, because the evidence was all altered in the autopsy, but he embalmed John Kennedy. So he said, well, ask your friend next time if she did anything, you know, what else he did. He got an embalming in a little funeral home in Arlington, you know, and they embalm him and they take him to Arlington Cemetery, you know. So maybe he's buried there. So maybe that makes sense. She comes back another day and she says, yeah, he's embalmed a lot of people. He embalmed Howard Hughes. Well, they have to, they don't have any funeral homes in Texas? They have to fly a guy to embalm from Arlington all the way out, you know. It's because there's only, like I say, 4 embalmers and 6 guys that do the autopsy. The autopsy on Nelson Rockefeller is done by the guy that went in to see the Kennedy evidence, Dr. Michael Baden, you know, and he's part of the different people show up. The psychiatrists show up. There's 2 psychiatrists that start mind control in this country. One of them says there's brainwashing in China, and the other one says there's brainwashing in Korea of the troops. And we say, oh my God, we've got to learn brainwashing ourselves. You know, we can't have the enemy outdo us. Now, how did they prove that there was brainwashing in those 2 countries? Anyone remember? Because the GIs came out in public and gave confessions that they had used chemical biological warfare there. So that, well, obviously they'd been brainwashed to say that. We wouldn't use chemical biological warfare. We're Americans. And so they were brainwashed, so we had to get our brainwash capacity geared up. Now, these 2 psychiatrists are named Jolly West and Dr. Robert J. Lifton. All right, and when I was doing the Jonestown research, which was a mind control experiment, I went back through 2,000 newspaper clippings, and on November the 19th, the day after the Jonestown massacre, there's 2 psychiatrists, one on the West Coast in the Examiner, and one on the East Coast in the New York Times, and the 2 of them are saying, it's not so unusual, large groups of people kill themselves all the time. It's Jolly West and Dr. Robert J. Lifton. Okay, it's these same 2 psychiatrists. Jolly West was the psychiatrist at trial for Jack Ruby, and Jolly West was the psychiatrist for Patty Hearst. And they moved them around into these different locations, you know. It's not unusual for a large group of people to kill themselves, huh? You know, if you push the Nazis far enough to admit that the bodies are there in the camps, the old ones who have Alzheimer's disease, is what I call it. They can't remember what they did during the war. If you push them far enough, they say, yeah, they were there are all those bodies, but you know what it was. There's a German word. It was lebensmüde. They were sick of life, and they formed suicide pacts, those Jews, and they killed themselves in the camps. Well, it was lebensmüde in Guyana, and unfortunately it's lebensmüde in the women's building because it's 10 p.m. Thank you for coming. I will do an hour and a half tomorrow night on Barry Scott, but I don't know when it starts. It's KPFA sometime between 7:30 and 11. I've heard 8 o'clock. KPFA.
Do you remember what issue of the Chronicle this was in?
I think it was the 20, no, maybe a little over, the 17 or 18.
July?
This is KPFK Los Angeles. We have been listening to author and researcher John Judge, as in Here Come the Judge. Since 1968, John Judge has been researching and has written articles, made radio and TV appearances on the invisible government, psychiatric abuse, military, Nazi influence on current history, international fascism, and terrorism. His parents used to work in the Pentagon, and his neighbors in Washington, D.C. worked in the CIA. John Judge, and this talk was given July 1987. If you would like copies of the tape, you can write Paul Bernardino, Bernardino, Bernardino. Info Network, (747) Ellis Street, ELLIS Street, number 4, San Francisco, 94102. John Judge from July 24th, 1987. From Paul Bernardino, Info Network, 747 Ellis Street, number 4, San Francisco, California, 94102. Okay, well, I told you your tape recorders would get hot with this talk. John Judge. Coming up, some more requested favorites from Immediate Gratification Night. But first, I think we should contract our business right now. A whole lot of people called earlier to request John Judge, and I happen to know that 94% of the people who wanted to hear John Judge are not subscribers to the station. So you can take this opportunity to thank us for being in on all this information, this presentation by John Judge, again, on KPFK on Something's Happening. I can't think offhand of a corporation that would fund a radio station or advertise in a radio station that played stuff out, such as John Judge and Nip and Dave. And that's why you will probably never hear him until the new age on mass media. But you can hear John Judge on KPFK. So that in itself, even this one talk, is worth the billions of dollars spent on the phony investigations about presidential managerial style. So if you are a listener and you're grateful for this program and you're not a subscriber, then please invest $20 or $40 for the next year to do your part to make sure that there is a station that can broadcast this type of material. Not because we're irresponsible or crazy or radical, but because we are a free speech station. We are interested in the other sides of questions having their time on the public platform too. So our phone number is area code 818-985-5735, 985-5735. You know, what is important, or all that is necessary for evil to conquer, is that the good people do nothing.